We're back talking now about adaptation to heat stress. So this is again going to be more of the chronic changes that we see with heat stress. The adaptations that are going to make us a little bit better at dealing with heat as well as exercise in the heat. So again, just to remind you of types of adaptations, we've talked about acclimation, which are those changes from naturally being in an environment. Acclimatization. Acclimation is more of those artificial environments. Habituation is just kind of a reduced response. We'll see some examples of this after heat adaptation. And then just to remind you, we've talked about other things as well. Conductance, that ability of the heat moving from one area to another based on kind of regions touching, as well as insulation, which would help to resist body heat loss, which again in hot environments is not something we're going to be looking for. So acclimatization to the heat is kind of an interesting one. It's one that you can definitely see and you can definitely experience. So again, these are going to be changes physiologically that are going to allow us to deal better with hot environments. In order for this to happen, you're going to need each of these days 2 to 4 hours of heat exposure. And it's usually a time course of about anywhere from about 7 to 14 days. But really within 5 to 10 days, you start seeing some differences in a number of things. And you can kind of see the example here. It's kind of showing you rectal temperatures at different levels here. So this would be the temperature in these ones right here. And then it's showing you heart rate, which you can see early on in the heat is much higher. As it goes throughout these days, it gets lower. And one of the things we see that can definitely change over this 5 to 10 day time course is sweat rate. You can see at the earlier days, sweat rate is not particularly high, not as many liters. And as we get further out, you can see that sweat rate increases. So that'll be one of the things we'll actually be talking about. But these are definitely these changes that can make us much more able to withstand these really hot days. And again, a lot of different factors are going to influence this. This is kind of a comprehensive list of which we'll be going through a lot of these, but things that are going to change to help this acclimatization are going to be things like better blood flow to the skin, better heat transfer from the core to the shell, being able to spread that cardiac output a little bit more efficiently. So we've got getting better at divvying up where the blood's going, how much we send to where. Still making sure we send enough to the muscles to meet demands while sending enough to the skin to cool. We'll see as we get more used to the heat, we'll start sweating at lower amounts, which allows evaporative cooling to start a little bit sooner. We sweat more efficiently. We use better use of the surface, so more effective evaporative cooling. We increase sweat rates. We decrease the salt concentration of sweat, which is going to help increase evaporative cooling. And it helps us preserve our electrolytes. So these are all things that we're going to hit on in a little bit more detail as we go through. But this is giving you the overall kind of summary of the different things we're going to see happening to help improve this acclimatization to the heat. And again, these would be things that would be kind of peripheral, central adaptations, as well as circulatory and metabolic adaptations. So some of these peripheral adaptations, so not relative to the core, but this would be more of like looking at sweat glands and other things like that. After being exposed to the heat for these 5 to 10 days, one of the things that we're going to see that starts happening is your threshold for the onset of sweating tends to become lower. So what this is saying is your core temp and your skin temp don't have to heat up as much for you to start sweating. The reason why this is good is, and again, in a hot environment, it means you're not going to bring on as much heat storage at the beginning of an activity. So you're not going to have as much heat to dissipate once you get going. Before the core temp gets up particularly high, we already are starting to cool. The other thing we're going to see is we see a more robust or more profound response to these increases in core and skin temperature. Our sweat glands become increasingly sensitive to sympathetic nerve stimulation. And what that is going to mean is, again, at any particular temperature we start sweating, we're going to sweat a little bit more, which again is going to increase that cooling, help us not build up as much heat. We are going to increase the capacity of these glands and Again, not over wet the skin with them. And this again is kind of showing, so this is from a study, it's showing you a few things here. This is looking at sweat rate versus body temp or core temp. Oops. That's looking at sweat rate versus core temp. So looking at the rectal temperature, and you can see the open circles are a number of participants looking at different core temperatures and their sweat rate. And you can see right here, there it is, their sweat rate. We have those folks that have been acclimated. You can see at the same or even lower core temps, they have begun sweating, and they're sweating at the same temps at a much higher rate. Again, this is going to mean cooling sooner and more cooling early on, which is going to really decrease the likelihood that there's going to be any heat storage going in there, and therefore really reduce any chance of hyperthermia where we're getting that overly high core temp. We don't have as much habituation. The other thing is our sweat glands start sweating more efficiently, so we don't use as much glycogen in these sweat glands to produce that sweat. What this means, we can sweat sooner at lower temps at higher rates, but without burning through a lot of nutrient stores, which allows us to maintain higher sweat rates for a longer period of time. Again, that's going to be a useful thing if you're in the heat. It's going to mean you're going to be able to cool for a longer period of time. Again, assuming hydration status is fine. And this again shows that. You can see exercise over a period of time. You can see on this side, those that are unacclimated have a much higher heart rate, where those that have been acclimated have a better heart rate. And if we're looking at the sweat rates of these same individuals, you can see the unacclimated individuals have a lower sweat rate relative to those that have been acclimated. The other thing we're going to see is where the sweating is happening. We are going to really sweat in areas where we wet more surface area and maximize the ability to evaporatively cool. So wetting large surface areas, so to more efficient sweating to the back, the chest areas. By putting it to these larger areas, we are going to minimize sweat dripping off. Again, any sweat that drips off the body without evaporating is a waste of sweat in reality, if we're talking about its effects on cooling. So our regional sweating is going to be more efficient to wet the skin surface and increase that ability to evaporatively cool. The other thing that we see over this period of time is we have an increased capacity to produce sweat. Generally, prior to acclimation, sweat capacity is about 1.5 liters per hour. It can go up anywhere from a third to about double that. So anywhere from 100% increase to like a 30% increase. And again, those maximum sweat rates can get quite high. The other thing we're going to see is we are going to get better vasodilation of the cutaneous vessels and better skin flow to this, better blood flow to the skin for any particular core temperature. And what this does is it's going to increase that ability to get convective heat transfer to the skin with this blood flow being increased to the skin. And let us have more evaporative and more convective heat loss out to the environment. All this happening means we are relying much more on that evaporative heat exchange to decrease that skin temp, but by relying on this more, it is going to get us a bigger temperature differential between the skin and the core, and what that will allow for better heat transfer from that core out to the skin through convection and conductive mechanisms, which means we can cool that core more efficiently. The other thing we see in this one is because we become more over this period of time, we're going to become more sensitive to the hormone aldosterone, which was part of some of those pathways we were talking about in the last set of shows here. But aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption from the urine, among other things. One of the things it also helps us do is decrease the amount of electrolytes in our sweat. So we are going to start producing a more dilute sweat. more dilute sweat is easier to evaporate, which is going to increase its ability to cool the body. So by having this decrease in salt content of our sweat, it is going to make the sweat able to more efficiently evaporate, which is meaning we can cool better. And this is again kind of showing that idea in acclimated versus unacclimated individuals. You can see the unacclimated individuals with the open circles on kind of above and to the left. Their sweat sodium concentration is higher at any particular sweat rate. We can see in those folks that have been acclimated, they have a lower salt concentration in their sweat. And you can also see they're sweating more, so they have an increased sweat rate, but increased sweat rate with less sodium in it. Again, just to remind everybody, the less sodium there is in that, the more water there is in the sweat, the more efficiently it does evaporate. And because of that, more efficient evaporation means more efficient cooling. So that is it for the kind of the first episode here. We will start looking at some of the other types of adaptations, more of those central adaptations, those muscular and metabolic adaptations. So I will see you next time.